I have never told this story outside of a close circle of friends, and even then I rarely share it in full, because every time I do I can still feel the cold air of that night crawling along my skin. It happened in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, in the late summer of 2014, when I was 24 years old and thought I knew everything about hiking, camping, and the outdoors. But nothing in my years of experience prepared me for what I encountered, and no map or guidebook warned me about what I came to learn the hard way. There are stories woven into these mountains, stories that the locals whisper over coffee in Boone or Asheville, stories that sound like folklore until you realize they are warnings. It started innocently enough when I moved to Chapel Hill for graduate school. One of my classmates, a girl named Sarah, mentioned her family owned a cabin near Mount Mitchell, the highest peak east of the Mississippi. She said the cabin had been empty for years, and when she offered to let a few of us stay there for a weekend getaway in August, I jumped at the chance. I had grown up reading about the Appalachian Trail, and the idea of breathing in that crisp mountain air and walking where generations had walked before thrilled me. What Sarah didn't mention right away, but what came out after a couple of beers one night, was that her grandmother used to tell her about something she called the voices of the ridgeline. According to her grandmother, people had gone missing there for decades, usually hikers or hunters, sometimes entire families, their belongings later found perfectly intact, as if they had just stepped away for a moment and never returned. Sarah laughed as she told it, rolling her eyes and saying her grandmother believed the mountains themselves had a soul that demanded offerings. We all dismissed it as an old woman's superstition. After all, if there's one thing you get used to in the South, it's hearing ghost stories passed down like family heirlooms. Still, something about the way she said it stuck in my head, and when I lay in bed that night, I thought about those words, the voices of the ridgeline. On Friday, August 22nd, 2014, four of us set out in Sarah's old Subaru. Sarah, her boyfriend Daniel, my roommate Mark, and me. The drive from Chapel Hill to Mount Mitchell took nearly 4 hours, and the closer we got, the more the world seemed to fold in on itself. Cell service vanished somewhere past Marion, and the road narrowed into winding switchbacks that hugged the mountain like a serpent. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, built in the 1950s and barely updated since, but it had charm. Creaky wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a wide porch that looked out across the rolling ridges, blue with mist even in the afternoon. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and for the first time in months, I felt truly away from the world. That first evening, we cooked hot dogs on the fire and drank cheap beer under the stars. Mark, who always loved to play the skeptic, teased Sarah about her grandmother's story. "So what exactly do these voices do?" he asked, tossing a pine cone into the flames. Sarah smirked, but I could see her hesitating before she answered. "They call to you," she said finally. She used to say you don't hear them at first, but then, when the wind is just right, you think someone's calling your name. And if you follow them too far, you don't come back. Daniel laughed and clinked his bottle against hers, saying something about hillbilly ghost stories, but I remember noticing how Sarah's eyes darted toward the tree line as if she half expected to see something there. Later that night, after everyone went to sleep, I stepped out onto the porch. The forest was alive with sounds, the distant chirp of crickets, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush, the low rush of wind weaving between the trees. For a moment I swore I heard something else layered beneath it, almost like a murmur, low and steady, but when I leaned closer it vanished. I told myself it was just the forest playing tricks, the way it always does if you stand too still. But as I stared out at the endless folds of mountains under the starlight, I thought about how long these ridges had been here, how many lives had been lost in them, and how small I felt standing on their edge. The Blue Ridge is older than memory itself, older than the rivers that cut through it and the towns that cling to its valleys. Maybe Sarah's grandmother wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe the mountains do have a soul. The next morning the sky was a pale gray, the kind of mountain light that makes everything look sharper and more fragile at the same time. And Sarah suggested we take one of the older trails that wound down past a series of abandoned homesteads from the early 1900s. She said her grandfather had once pointed them out to her, stone chimneys rising out of the earth where entire families used to live before the land grew too harsh and unforgiving. The four of us set off with backpacks, water bottles, and a little too much optimism. But within half an hour of leaving the cabin, I felt a change in the air that I couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't colder, not exactly, but heavier, as if each breath required effort, as if the forest itself was pressing in on us. The trees grew thicker, the canopy darker, and the trail, though marked on Sarah's old map, looked like it hadn't been used in years. We found the first chimney not far from the path, covered in moss and surrounded by blackberry bushes. The house that had once stood there was long gone, but something about the stones unsettled me. They were too intact, like a monument rather than a ruin. And when I leaned closer, I noticed small carvings etched into one of them. Circles, spirals, and what looked like a crude shape of a person with arms outstretched. Mark laughed it off, saying they were just old settler doodles. But Sarah went quiet and kept moving. By the time we reached the second chimney, the air felt thicker still, and I realized I hadn't heard a bird in nearly 20 minutes. Even the wind seemed to have died, and there was a silence so absolute it felt unnatural. Daniel tried to lighten the mood by saying we'd stumbled into some Appalachian version of the Blair Witch Project, but none of us laughed. The silence grew oppressive until, suddenly, I thought I heard something break it. At first it was faint, so faint I thought it was my own mind filling the void, but then it sharpened. My name, carried on the stillness like a thread of smoke. I froze in place. It wasn't Mark or Sarah or Daniel. They were ahead of me, moving slowly through the brush, and it wasn't my imagination. Someone had called me. My throat went dry, and I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself it was just the way sound carried in these mountains, echoing strangely, bouncing from ridge to ridge. But a few minutes later, as we stopped to catch our breath, I heard it again, this time closer, clearer, unmistakable. My name, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and not. I turned sharply, scanning the trees, but saw nothing but shadows and green. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to be the one to spook the group, but I knew then that Sarah's grandmother's story wasn't just folklore. Something in those woods knew my name. When we finally returned to the cabin late that afternoon, I felt a weight lift, as if I'd stepped out of water. Sarah admitted she hadn't wanted to say it earlier, but she too had heard her name in the woods, whispered low as if someone were crouched behind her shoulder. Daniel brushed it off, insisting it was just wind or nerves, but the look in Sarah's eyes told me she didn't believe that. That night a storm rolled over the mountains, thunder cracking so close it rattled the windows, rain drumming on the roof with a violence that made the cabin feel like it might collapse. Mark was restless, pacing, muttering about how he couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't been alone on the trail. Around midnight, the power flickered out, leaving us with only the glow of the fireplace and a couple of flashlights. That was when it happened. A sound rose beneath the storm, a low hum that didn't belong to wind or rain. It was like a chorus, dozens of voices weaving together in tones too ancient to decipher, vibrating through the walls, seeping into the marrow of my bones. At first it was distant, like hearing a hymn carried on the air from a faraway church, but then it grew louder, closer, surrounding us, until the cabin itself seemed to tremble with it. Sarah clutched Daniel's arm and whispered that this was what her grandmother meant, the voices of the ridgeline. And as they swelled, I realized with a sickening certainty that they weren't coming from outside the cabin. They were coming from all around us, through the walls, the floor, even the air we were breathing, calling, beckoning, demanding. I don't know how long we sat there frozen in the flickering firelight, listening to that impossible sound wrapping itself around us like a living thing, but at some point Daniel grabbed one of the flashlights and said he wasn't going to sit there waiting for the storm to swallow the cabin. He swung the beam toward the window, and for a split second I thought I saw something move just beyond the glass. Not a face, not even a figure exactly, but the unmistakable impression of presence, as if the darkness itself leaned forward to meet the light. Sarah screamed and pulled him back, but he insisted we had to leave before the mountain roads washed out. Against all reason we followed him, because staying in that suffocating hum felt even worse than facing the storm outside. We pulled on jackets, shoved gear into backpacks, and stepped into the downpour. The rain came down in sheets, cold enough to sting, and the mud sucked at our boots with every step. But what unsettled me more than the storm was the fact that the voices followed us outside. They didn't fade when we left the cabin. They grew louder, clearer, rising and falling like the tide, weaving around our names in tones that felt almost intimate. The trail that had been familiar just hours before seemed unrecognizable in the storm. Landmarks disappeared in the dark, and the flashlight beams caught nothing but water and endless trees. At one point, Mark shouted that he saw lights flickering deeper in the woods, like lanterns swaying, but when we turned to look, they vanished, leaving only the endless rain. Panic set in then. Sarah clung to Daniel's arm, sobbing that she wanted to go back to the cabin. But when we turned, the way behind us looked just as alien, swallowed by fog that hadn't been there a moment before. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears, but beneath it the voices threaded through, steady, calm, deliberate. And then, as sudden as lightning, one voice separated itself from the chorus. It spoke not in whispers, but in a tone that was sharp and clear, and it said my name. Not just my name. It said it the way my father used to when I was a child, with that exact cadence, that exact warmth, a sound no stranger could ever mimic. My knees buckled. I wanted to follow it, to step off the trail and sink into the blackness of the trees where it seemed to be calling me. Every instinct screamed at me to obey, to walk toward that impossible comfort. I don't know what would have happened if Sarah hadn't grabbed my arm and yanked me back with a force I didn't know she had. She shouted over the storm, asking what I thought I was doing, and in that moment the spell broke. I realized how close I had come to disappearing into the night, like all those names Sarah's grandmother had whispered about. We stumbled on for what felt like hours, though later I realized it couldn't have been more than 40 minutes. Then, without warning, the storm began to ease. The rain softened to a drizzle, the fog thinned, and we emerged into a clearing none of us recognized. In the center stood another chimney, taller than the others we had seen earlier, perfectly preserved though no house remained around it. And there, carved into the stone, was a spiral so fresh it looked as if it had been etched that very day. The voices fell silent. The silence was even worse than the sound, because it carried a weight that made my chest ache. Daniel, ever the skeptic, walked up to the chimney and laid his hand on the carvings, muttering that it was probably some prank left by teenagers. But the second his palm touched the stone, the air shifted again. The ground trembled beneath our feet, not like an earthquake, but like a pulse, steady and alive. The hum returned, low at first, then building, and this time it didn't surround us. It came from the chimney itself, vibrating through the stones until I thought they might burst apart. Sarah screamed for him to stop, but Daniel kept his hand there, transfixed, eyes wide as if something unseen was holding him in place. It took all three of us pulling together to tear him away, and when we did, he collapsed into the mud, gasping like someone who had been underwater too long. His eyes darted wildly, and he whispered that he had seen faces in the stone, hundreds of them, pressed together, their mouths moving in unison. That was when we knew we had to run. We didn't care where, we just ran, tearing through the brush with the voices chasing us, rising and falling in terrible waves, always just behind our ears. My legs burned, branches cut at my face, but fear kept me moving until suddenly, impossibly, we stumbled back onto the dirt road that led to the cabin. The storm had cleared almost completely, stars beginning to break through the clouds. For a long time, none of us spoke. We just stood there, dripping, shaking, unable to comprehend how we had gone so far off trail only to end up back where we started. The cabin loomed ahead, quiet, ordinary, as if nothing had happened at all. But we knew better. We knew something had seen us, had called us, had nearly taken us. We didn't sleep that night, though we tried. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the spiral on that chimney, glowing faintly in the dark, or heard the echo of my father's voice calling me into the trees. Daniel sat in silence by the fireplace, shivering though the flames burned high, And when Sarah asked him what he had seen in the stone, he refused to answer, only shaking his head with a look that told us he never wanted to speak of it again. At dawn, we packed the car in silence. None of us mentioned breakfast or staying another night. We all knew we had to leave. The road down the mountain seemed longer than before, winding endlessly, and every shadow looked like it might peel away from the trees and follow us. When we finally reached cell service near Marion, our phones lit up with missed calls and messages, but none of us spoke for nearly an hour. It was as if saying it out loud would give it power again. Weeks passed before Sarah confessed something to me over coffee back in Chapel Hill. She said that when we were in the clearing with the chimney, just before the ground pulsed, she had heard her grandmother's voice among the chorus, not calling her name, but warning her, "Don't answer, don't listen." I asked her if she believed her grandmother's old story now, and she only nodded, eyes fixed on the table as if she could still hear that chorus beneath the hum of the cafe. Mark dealt with it by joking more than ever, telling anyone who asked that the trip had been ruined by bad weather and Daniel's stubbornness. But I noticed he stopped going on hikes, even on the gentle trails around campus. As for Daniel, he grew quieter, withdrawn. One night months later, he admitted to me that he still dreamed of the faces in the stone, mouths moving in silence, eyes wide and pleading, as if they were trapped behind glass and waiting for someone to free them. He said sometimes, just as he was falling asleep, he felt a vibration in the mattress, steady like a heartbeat, and would wake drenched in sweat. I told him to see a doctor, but deep down I knew no prescription could touch what we had brushed against. As for me, I tried to bury it, but the mountains never let me go. In the summer of 2017, I returned alone, against every instinct, drawn back like a moth to the flame. I told myself I wanted closure, that I needed to prove to myself it had all been a storm-fed hallucination, but the truth is I was afraid of forgetting. The cabin was still there, though weathered and sagging now, the porch overtaken by vines. I didn't go inside. Instead, I walked down the trail again, only a short way, just enough to see if the chimneys remained. The first was there, mossy and broken, silent in the morning sun. But when I reached the place where the second should have been, there was nothing but open earth, no stones, no carvings, not even a trace that anything had ever stood there. I felt the air grow heavy, and though the forest was alive with birdsong, I realized I couldn't hear them anymore. The silence pressed against my ears until I turned and ran, heart pounding, not stopping until I was back in my car on the main road. I never went back after that. Some nights I still dream of the spiral, twisting endlessly, pulling me inward, and I wake with the certainty that the mountains remember me, that they are patient, that they are waiting. Sarah's grandmother used to say the ridgeline has a voice because it has a memory, older than the towns, older than the settlers, older than the tribes who came before. She said it takes what it needs to keep that memory alive, to feed its soul. I believe her now. I don't know what the mountains wanted from us, why they called us, why they showed us what they did, but I know this. When people vanish in the Blue Ridge, when hikers step off the trail and never return, it is not by accident. It is because they answered. And sometimes, when I'm alone and the world is quiet, I think I still hear my name, faint but insistent, carried on a wind that doesn't belong to this place. I tell myself I won't listen, that I won't follow, but deep down I know the ridgeline is patient, and one day it may call again.